After an unexpected visit to her husband's office, Isabella Evans witnesses the unimaginable. Landon, the man she loves, caught in an intimate moment with Wendy, his colleague. Before she can confront him, Landon suffers a heart attack followed by a stroke, leaving him unable to speak. Yet what seemed like the most devastating part of this betrayal was only the beginning, a web of lies and secrets that would threaten everything Isabella thought she knew. Isabella Evans believed her life was a perfectly framed painting. At 32, she had achieved what many considered the pinnacle of personal success. Born into an influential family in Seattle, she grew up surrounded by comfort, but never succumbed to the trap of arrogance. Her father, Arthur Evans, was a stern man, the owner of one of the most respected engineering firms on the west coast of the United States, while her mother, Margaret, had passed away when Isabella was only 12, leaving her with the legacy of a resilient heart and admirable determination. Landon Mitchell entered her life like a hurricane when she was 24. He was charming, ambitious, and had a smile that seemed to erase any doubt. They met at an event for her father's company, and the chemistry was instant. Landon wasn't just handsome. He possessed a magnetic confidence, an energy that made people believe in him. He had worked hard to get where he was, growing up in a modest working-class family in rural Oregon. His rise was marked by sacrifices and dreams, and Isabella believed every word. 6 months after their first meeting, they were engaged. The wedding was a modern fairy tale. Among the historic mansions of Queen Anne, they chose one to live in, a spacious Victorian house with large windows and a discreet view of Elliott Bay. The house reflected who they were, or who Isabella believed they were, a facade of classic beauty supported by seemingly unshakable pillars. Landon quickly became one of the most promising executives at Arthur's company, while Isabella, with her grace and charisma, became the face of philanthropic campaigns that bolstered the firm's image. But perfection is treacherous. It's a fragile balance that can shatter with the slightest touch, and that's exactly what happened. That day, Isabella woke up earlier than usual. It was a cold, rainy Friday typical of Seattle, with raindrops softly drumming against the bedroom windows. She looked to her side and saw the bed was empty. Landon had already left for work. He always left early, a habit Isabella admired, though she'd noticed he'd been coming home later and later. His commitment seemed to have multiplied in recent weeks, but Isabella never questioned it. After all, what is love if not trust? She decided to surprise him. It was a spontaneous idea, something she hadn't done in a long time. She baked a simple cake, a tradition from her childhood, something her mother had taught her. As she waited for the cake to cool, she spent a few minutes looking out the kitchen window, watching the wet streets and hurried people under colorful umbrellas. A strange tightness gripped her chest, an uncomfortable intuition she couldn't shake, but she brushed the thought aside. It was just her imagination, she told herself. She put on a long beige coat, carefully wrapped the cake, and drove to his office. The Evans Engineering Building was imposing, a modern glass tower that mirrored Seattle's gray skies. Isabella passed through reception with ease, as she always did, and headed to the floor where Landon worked. As she approached his office, she heard muffled laughter. At first, she thought it was a relaxed meeting, but when she pushed the slightly ajar door open, Isabella's world crumbled. Landon was there with Wendy Harper, his colleague, a red-haired woman with striking curves and a dangerous air of self-assurance. They were too close, too intimate. Isabella froze. For a moment, it felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. It was like watching a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Wendy was perched on the edge of Landon's desk, one hand resting on his shoulder. He laughed, but it wasn't casual. It was a complicit laugh, laden with a familiarity Isabella knew too well. She didn't need to hear anything else. The betrayal was laid bare before her. She couldn't speak. The words died in her throat as Wendy noticed her presence and quickly pulled away, trying to appear composed. Landon, pale as a ghost, began stammering, but couldn't finish. And then it happened. Landon clutched his chest, his eyes wide with pain. Isabella thought it was a trick to distract her, but the collapse was real. In seconds, he fell to the ground, unable to breathe. Chaos erupted in the room. Isabella, still in shock, instinctively called the paramedics while Wendy ran to get help. Those minutes felt like an eternity. When the paramedics arrived, they confirmed Isabella's worst fear. Landon had suffered a heart attack followed by a stroke. He was rushed to the hospital. leaving Isabella alone in the room with the shattered pieces of her trust scattered on the floor. The rain outside seemed heavier as Isabella drove to the hospital. Seattle was cloaked in melancholic grey, the clouds obscuring any trace of the sun. The city, once vibrant and welcoming, now mirrored her state of mind, somber, heavy, suffocating. She parked and entered the hospital, where the smell of disinfectant and the distant sound of heart monitors only intensified her anguish. That night, while Landon lay unconscious in the ICU, Isabella was informed that the stroke had caused severe damage. He would survive, but his speech and mobility were compromised. As she processed the news, the image of Landon with Wendy kept invading her mind. The pain of betrayal mingled with the compassion she still felt. The man who had destroyed her trust was now utterly dependent on her. At that moment, Isabella realized the dilemma that would define the next chapters of her life. She could walk away, leave Landon to face the consequences of his choices alone, or she could stay, care for him, even though every day by his side would be a painful reminder of her heartbreak. There was no easy answer. What had begun as a life built on love and trust was now crumbling brick by brick, leaving Isabella in an emotional abyss. As she gazed out the hospital window, watching the city lights flicker through the rain, one thing was clear: nothing in her life would ever be the same again. In the early years of their marriage, Isabella and Landon seemed like an unbreakable couple. She saw in him not just a partner, but also a friend and confidant. Landon knew how to listen to her, how to turn even the most mundane days into something special. There were impromptu candle-lit dinners and weekends spent exploring Seattle neighborhoods like Capitol Hill, where they would linger in cozy coffee shops, talking about life and their dreams. Landon often spoke about starting his own consulting firm someday, while Isabella, with her more pragmatic spirit, urged him to solidify his career before taking such a big risk. It was this balance between his dreamy passion and her practical sensibility that seemed to bind their souls together. Landon also showed a particular affection for Arthur, Isabella's father. The two developed a professional relationship that transcended the workplace. Arthur saw in Landon a determination he greatly valued, and Landon seemed eager to impress him. This bond reinforced Isabella's trust, making her believe she had chosen someone who not only loved her, but also respected her family. She still remembered how Landon seemed genuinely emotional when asking for her hand in marriage during a small party on the terrace of the Four Seasons Hotel, with the city lights as their backdrop. In that moment, Isabella believed her future was secure, but perfection was an illusion. As the years passed, small signs began to appear, though Isabella, consumed by her own projects and family dynamics, chose to ignore them. Landon began to seem more distant, claiming to be overwhelmed by new challenges at work. Isabella believed him, as she always did, because she never imagined their trust could be broken. Yet in hindsight, she realized how blind she had been. He started arriving late to important dinners, avoiding deeper conversations, and seemed easily irritated by trivial matters. All of this was explained away as stress, and Isabella accepted his excuses without question. She loved Landon, and to her, love meant patience and understanding. Wendy Harper entered Landon's world like an unexpected storm, with her fiery red hair and green eyes that seemed to shine with an almost hypnotic intensity. She was the opposite of Isabella. While Isabella exuded a gentle, elegant presence, Wendy radiated energy and boldness. Known in the company for her relentless determination and her knack for commanding a room, Wendy quickly climbed the corporate ladder, working directly with Landon on high-level projects. The constant contact between them created a dangerous closeness, something Isabella never imagined, but now seemed so obvious. Wendy was everything Landon needed in a moment of existential crisis. While Isabella offered stability, Wendy represented excitement and the unknown. But Wendy wasn't merely an accomplice in a clandestine affair. She was ambitious, seeing Landon as a means to achieve her own goals. Working alongside him, she identified his weaknesses and exploited them. To Wendy, love was secondary. Power and influence were what truly mattered. Once she had Landon in her sights, she ensnared him with her sharp wit and her ability to make him feel indispensable. For Isabella, discovering Wendy as Landon's lover was a devastating blow, but the pain wasn't confined to the betrayal alone. Wendy was the embodiment of everything Isabella had never wanted to be: manipulative, selfish, and without boundaries. Still, Isabella couldn't help but feel a morbid curiosity about what had happened between them. She wanted to understand what Landon had seen in Wendy that he couldn't find in their marriage. At first, Isabella tried to focus solely on Landon's condition, but thoughts of Wendy were like a poison slowly spreading through her mind. Every time she entered Landon's hospital room and saw him connected to tubes and machines, she felt torn between the love she once had for him and the corrosive anger of his betrayal. He lay there, utterly vulnerable, and Isabella couldn't abandon him even if she wanted to. Part of her still clung to the memory of the man he had once been, even though she now doubted if that man had ever truly existed. Landon's debilitated state didn't just affect Isabella emotionally, it also disrupted everything around her. Arthur, despite always having respected Landon, was deeply disappointed upon learning of his betrayal. Publicly, he decided to focus on Landon's recovery to preserve the company's image. Privately, however, Arthur didn't hide his resentment. To him, Landon wasn't just a son-in-law who had betrayed his daughter, he was a man who had jeopardized the integrity of the family. Landon's absence from the company was immediately felt. He had been responsible for overseeing critical projects, and his inability to continue working caused delays and confusion. Isabella, who had never before been directly involved in the family business, felt compelled to step in. It was a way to divert her attention from the emotional storm consuming her, while ensuring her father's work didn't suffer. However, taking on this role brought its own challenges. She faced distrust from some employees who saw her as inexperienced, as well as mounting suspicion that something was amiss behind the scenes. Between hospital visits and company meetings, Isabella began to realize how her life had turned into a suffocating routine. What had once been a balanced existence, with room for her passions and hobbies, was now a marathon of heavy responsibilities. She felt torn between her sense of duty and the desire to simply run away, leave everything behind, and start fresh in a place where no one knew her. But Isabella knew that wasn't a viable option. She carried within her a sense of responsibility that wouldn't let her give up, even when everything seemed lost. As days turned into weeks, Isabella realized she needed to start making decisions. The past couldn't be erased, but she still had the power to shape the future. However, to do so, she would have to confront the painful truths that continued to emerge. As much as she wanted to forget Wendy, she knew the woman held answers only she could provide. Isabella was determined to uncover everything, not just about the affair, but about who Landon truly was. She needed to understand how the man who had vowed to love her had become someone so distant and destructive. Meanwhile, Landon's frail, vulnerable figure remained a cruel reminder of all that had been lost. He was alive, but the man Isabella had once known seemed to have vanished. The connection that had once united them was now buried under a mountain of lies, and Isabella wondered if she would ever be free of the weight it represented. Deep down, she knew her journey was only beginning, and the choices she made from that moment on would define not just her life, but the legacy she would leave for herself. The weeks following Landon's stroke turned Isabella's life into an emotional battlefield. Each morning she woke up in her empty house, facing the deafening silence that seemed to echo her deepest anxieties. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of rain against the windows were her only constant companions. It was strange how time seemed to both crawl and race, with entire days dissolving into a blur of hospital visits, company meetings, and relentless thoughts about Landon and Wendy. The hospital had become the epicenter of her routine. Isabella arrived early in the afternoon, greeting the nurses with an automatic smile before preparing herself to face Landon. He sat in his bed, his expression vacant, as though lost in his own mind. The stroke had severely impaired his speech, turning words into disconnected murmurs. He tried to communicate but often grew frustrated, striking the armrest of his wheelchair with impotent effort. In the beginning, Isabella tried to maintain a neutral demeanor, hiding her feelings behind a facade of calm. But as their visits grew more frequent, it became impossible to suppress the waves of anger and sadness that swept over her. The dilemma of caring for Landon while grappling with his betrayal felt like a continuous form of torture. He was the man she had loved for years, but also the man who had shattered the foundation of her trust. The guilt over these conflicting feelings consumed her. Sometimes she wondered if caring for him was an unconscious form of punishment, not just for him, but for herself as well. She would sit beside him, helping him with meals he could barely manage to eat on his own. The simple act of bringing a spoon to his mouth seemed monumental for Landon, and each failed attempt filled Isabella with a bitter mix of pity and resentment. She watched him closely, searching for any trace of the man she had known, but all she saw was a stranger. He avoided her gaze, perhaps out of shame or regret. On the rare occasions their eyes met, Isabella felt that he knew. He knew what he had done and how deeply he had hurt her. But he never spoke of it, and Isabella never asked. The silence between them was an unbridgeable chasm. As she cared for Landon, the fragmented pieces of his betrayal began to take shape in her mind, though they always felt incomplete. It wasn't just the affair with Wendy. There was something more. Something about their relationship felt deeper and more intricate than Isabella had initially suspected. She found herself reflecting on the times Landon came home late, how he quickly ended phone calls or avoided discussing work whenever she asked. Their relationship hadn't been a mere impulsive mistake. There was something deliberate about the way he had betrayed her. One particularly tense afternoon, her suspicions deepened. Isabella was reorganizing old papers in Landon's home office, trying to resolve an issue with a company account. Among the contracts and reports, she found a folder labeled Wendy. Inside were handwritten notes, some by Landon, others by her. The notes seemed related to specific projects, but something about the numbers and scribbled comments stood out. They referred to expenses that didn't make sense. Isabella didn't fully understand what she was looking at, but she knew it wasn't trivial. Back at the hospital, while assisting Landon with his physical therapy, the tension boiled over. She was holding his arm, helping him with simple movements, when the anger she had been bottling up erupted. "I need to know," she said, her voice trembling. "What did you have with Wendy? How could you do this to me, Landon?" He tried to say something, but his words came out as unintelligible murmurs. Isabella felt a knot tighten in her throat. This inability to answer, this barrier between what she needed to know and what he could offer, was maddening. She let go of his arm abruptly and stepped back, tears beginning to well up. "You have no idea what you've put me through," she continued. "I'm here taking care of you, and all I can think about is how you destroyed everything." Landon looked at her, his eyes filled with something Isabella couldn't interpret. Was it regret, despair, or just the empty reaction of someone who had no choice but to accept what was happening? "I just want to understand," she said, more to herself than to him. "I need to understand how you could do this to me." That conversation had no resolution. Landon attempted to lift his hand, as if to reach for her or say something, but he gave up. He lowered his head, and Isabella realized she wouldn't get any answers from him. Not in this state. In the days that followed, unsettling discoveries began to surface. Isabella started scrutinizing Landon's financial records and old emails more closely. The discrepancies in the numbers became clearer, as did the patterns of his behavior in the months leading up to the stroke. Everything pointed to a larger scheme, something involving Wendy and possibly her father's company. Isabella began to wonder if Landon's betrayal wasn't just personal, but professional as well, potentially endangering her entire family. As difficult as it was, living with Landon now felt crucial for piecing together the puzzle, but every day spent by his side was an emotional test. He seemed to sense her emotional distance and occasionally made small attempts at reconciliation, like reaching for her hand or holding her gaze for prolonged moments. Isabella didn't know how to react. Part of her wanted to feel something again, but the pain of betrayal was a wall she couldn't climb. While Landon struggled to recover physically, Isabella was fighting an equally intense internal battle. The anger, sadness, and need for answers were eating away at her. She knew she couldn't go on like this forever. At some point, she would have to confront Wendy and uncover the dark truths she was hiding. But for now, Isabella stayed by Landon's side, trapped in a cycle of care and resentment, trying to find her way out of the emotional labyrinth. From the beginning, Isabella's father, Arthur Evans, had always been a figure of strength and discipline in her life. As the founder and CEO of Evans Engineering, he was a man who had built an empire with his own hands, overcoming countless challenges and accepting nothing less than excellence from those around him. Isabella deeply admired this determination, though she also resented the emotional rigidity that came with it. For Arthur, the world was divided between what was useful and what was expendable, a view that left little room for human frailties. After Landon's stroke, the relationship between father and daughter began to shift. Arthur initially showed concern for his son-in-law's condition, but it quickly became clear that his primary focus was on protecting the company and, by extension, the family. In private meetings, he made it clear to Isabella that, regardless of Landon's condition, business had to proceed without interruption. Arthur's loyalty to the family was unquestionable, but his pragmatic approach often came across as callous. "We can't allow Landon's mistakes, whatever they may be, to jeopardize everything we've built," he told her during one of their conversations. "I want you to keep an eye on operations. If anything suspicious comes up, I need to know immediately." Those words hung over Isabella like a shadow. It was difficult for her to process what Arthur was implying. He had never openly expressed distrust toward Landon before, but now he seemed certain that something was amiss. Isabella began to suspect her father knew more than he was letting on. This unsettled her, but also spurred her to dig deeper. What could Landon have done to provoke such a reaction from Arthur? During this tumultuous time, Isabella found solace in Claire Robinson, a longtime friend. Claire, a corporate compliance attorney and a loyal confidant, had a pragmatic outlook that often served as a counterbalance to Isabella's more emotional nature. The two had met in college and maintained a strong friendship over the years, despite their careers taking them in different directions. "I always had a feeling something was off about him," Claire said during a lunch at a small cafe in Capitol Hill after Isabella confided in her about recent events. "Men like Landon, they're charming until you start noticing the cracks. I don't know if I can handle this alone, Claire," Isabella replied, stirring her tea absently. "He's there, dependent on me, and all I can think about is how much he's hurt me." Claire reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over Isabella's. "You don't have to do this alone. If you need help figuring out what's going on with the company, I can look at the documents. Just tell me what you need." That offer marked the beginning of a subplot that would eventually expose some of the darkest truths about Landon. Claire began reviewing contracts and financial records from Evans Engineering, focusing on those involving Landon and Wendy. Her expertise quickly led her to identify troubling discrepancies, including transfers to obscure accounts and contracts that appeared inflated. While not definitive evidence of wrongdoing, the findings were enough to raise serious concerns. Meanwhile, Isabella noticed an unexpected shift in her dynamic with her father. Though still focused on the company, Arthur began to show a more human side, something Isabella had rarely experienced. One night, as they were reviewing documents in his home office, Arthur paused and looked at her, his eyes filled with a sincerity that caught her off guard. "You're handling this better than I expected," he said. "I know I haven't been the kind of father you can lean on in times like these, but I want you to know I'm here, no matter what happens." Those words stunned Isabella. She had never imagined hearing something like that from Arthur. For a brief moment, the weight of everything she was carrying seemed to lighten. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as she thought, but not everything offered comfort. Subtle signs of deeper issues within the company began to emerge. Isabella noticed that key employees were more reserved than usual, avoiding direct contact or sidestepping specific questions about projects Landon had overseen. One financial analyst, Brian Carter, casually mentioned to Claire that Landon and Wendy often spent excessive time in private meetings, insisting that certain reports be handled discreetly. It was an innocuous remark on the surface, but one that further fueled Isabella's suspicions. In addition, Isabella found an archived email from Landon to Wendy that seemed particularly incriminating. It included a cryptic mention of keeping the numbers off the main reports until everything is resolved. The email lacked details, but its ambiguous language suggested something improper. She shared the email with Claire, who immediately noted that it could be a clue pointing to a larger scheme. As these pieces of evidence accumulated, Isabella faced equally personal emotional challenges. During one hospital visit, Landon attempted to write something for her on a notepad. His hand trembled so badly that the words were nearly illegible, but Isabella managed to decipher what appeared to be an apology. Sorry for everything. It affected her more deeply than she expected. Reconciling the man who now seemed remorseful and vulnerable with the man who had so thoroughly betrayed her trust was an agonizing contradiction. Claire's constant presence helped Isabella maintain her sanity. On several occasions, Claire urged her not to let guilt or anger consume her. "You have every right to be angry, Isabella," Claire said one evening as they organized papers in Isabella's office. "But you also have the right to move forward. He made his choices, and now you have to make yours." Those words struck a chord in Isabella. She knew Claire was right, but moving on felt monumental. Even so, the growing evidence that Landon was involved in something far bigger than an affair began to give Isabella a sense of purpose. She needed to uncover the truth, not only to protect the company and her family, but also to find closure for herself. As the days passed, the signs of Landon's scheme became increasingly evident. Isabella knew she was edging closer to a revelation that would change everything. What she didn't realize was that this pursuit of truth would force her to confront not only Landon's past, but also her own choices that had led her to this moment. The line between justice and vengeance was beginning to blur, and Isabella was about to discover that sometimes the truth can be more painful than any lie. The moment arrived on a grey afternoon when Isabella finally decided she could no longer avoid Wendy. The doubts that had been eating away at her and the fragmented pieces of information she had gathered about Landon and his accomplice needed to be confronted. She could no longer bear the weight of uncertainty. Wendy was an essential piece of this dark puzzle, and Isabella knew the only way to understand the extent of Landon's betrayal and secrets was to look directly into the eyes of the woman who had participated in destroying her life. Isabella didn't arrange a formal meeting. Instead, she followed Wendy after spotting her by chance at a cafe near her father's company. It was a discreet place, with large windows offering a view of Seattle's busy streets. Wendy sat alone, a laptop open, and an almost untouched coffee in front of her. She appeared focused, but Isabella knew this woman wasn't just a dedicated executive. She was someone with a lot to hide. As she entered the cafe, Isabella felt her heart race. Wendy looked up as Isabella stopped in front of her, momentarily surprised, but her expression quickly shifted to one of calculated composure. "Isabella," Wendy said, closing the laptop with a slow, deliberate motion, "I figured it was only a matter of time before you came to find me. We need to talk," Isabella said, her voice steady but low enough not to attract attention from others in the cafe. Wendy gestured for Isabella to sit. Despite the tension between them, the redhead maintained a relaxed posture, as if she were in control of the situation. Isabella felt her anger rising but forced herself to stay composed. She wasn't here to explode. She was here to get answers. "I'll get straight to the point," Isabella began, leaning slightly across the table. "I know about you and Landon. I know you were involved, and I know he planned to leave our marriage. What I want to know is why. How did it all start?" Wendy sighed, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. For a moment, she seemed to deliberate whether or not to answer, but ultimately chose honesty, or at least her version of it. "It started the way these things usually start, Isabella. Attraction, proximity at work. Landon was unhappy. He told me he felt lost in a marriage he didn't know how to fix." "And you believed him?" Isabella interrupted, her voice laced with disbelief. "You believed he was the poor husband trapped in a loveless marriage?" Wendy gave a small, ironic smile. "I'm not naive, Isabella. I knew he wasn't perfect, but I also knew what I wanted, and what I wanted was Landon." Wendy's words hit Isabella like a blow to the chest, but she couldn't back down. There was still more to uncover. "He said he planned to leave me," Isabella continued, the anger in her voice now more evident. "Was that true? Was he really going to abandon everything?" Wendy hesitated for a moment, as if reluctant to reveal the truth, but finally replied, "Yes, he wanted to end the marriage. We were discussing how he would do it, but there was something else." Wendy paused as if weighing how much more to share. "Something else?" Isabella pressed, feeling the tension mount. "He was worried about your father, Landon. He was involved in something that could hurt much more than your marriage. There was money, Isabella. Money that shouldn't have been there." Wendy's words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to process what she was hearing. "What kind of money?" Isabella asked, though deep down she was already beginning to understand. "Money diverted from company contracts. Landon was manipulating numbers, inflating costs with partners, and skimming the difference. I helped him with some of it," Wendy admitted, without a hint of remorse in her voice. "It was supposed to be a way for us to build something together, something outside of here. A fresh start." Isabella felt her stomach churn. Landon hadn't just betrayed their marriage, he had also betrayed her father's trust and jeopardized the company's reputation. The anger she felt now was mixed with a wave of despair. What else had he done? And what was left of her life now that these truths were emerging? "Do you have any idea what this means?" Isabella asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "You put my entire family at risk." "Landon made his choices, Isabella. I just facilitated what he already wanted to do," Wendy replied indifferently. It was impossible for Isabella to comprehend how someone could be so cold, so calculating. Wendy seemed to feel no remorse for her actions. She had stolen Isabella's husband and participated in a scheme that threatened to destroy everything her family had built, and yet she spoke as if it were just another day at the office. The conversation ended abruptly. Isabella couldn't bear to listen to Wendy justify her actions any longer. She left the cafe without looking back, her mind racing with the revelations. She needed to act, but first she needed proof, something that could confirm Wendy's claims and protect her family. In the days that followed, Isabella threw herself into her own investigation. She spent hours poring over old documents in Landon's office and accessing emails he had left open. It was there that she found the evidence confirming Wendy's words: suspicious bank transfers, contracts with inflated values, and invoices that didn't match real services. Everything pointed to a systematic, carefully orchestrated scheme. In one email, she found something that made her shudder. It was a conversation between Landon and Wendy, discussing details about their plan to escape together, using the embezzled money to start a new life in another city, far from Seattle. Landon's words were a mix of promises and justifications. He wrote about how much he loved Wendy, and how he couldn't continue living the life he had with Isabella. But there was something else, a mention of a deadline, of closing one last deal before leaving. It was clear Landon had planned not only to abandon their marriage, but also to leave behind the entire life he had built in Seattle. And now he lay helpless in a hospital, while the pieces of his life crumbled around Isabella. Back at the hospital, Isabella entered Landon's room and stood silently for a long moment. He sat on the bed, his gaze distant, as always. When he noticed her presence, he tried to smile, but the gesture was weak, almost non-existent. Isabella sat beside him, holding one of the documents she had uncovered during her investigation. "I know everything, Landon," she said, her voice carrying a firmness he had never heard before. "I know about the money, the falsified contracts. I know you were planning to run away with Wendy." He tried to say something, but no words came out. His eyes widened, and Isabella could see he understood the gravity of the situation. "I'm taking this to the authorities," she continued. "Not for you, but to protect my father, to protect the company from your greed." Landon lowered his head, defeated. Isabella felt no compassion at that moment, only a sense that she was finally taking control of the situation. She stood, ready to leave the room, but before walking out she looked back and added, "You destroyed me, Landon, but I won't let you destroy anyone else." With that, she left the room, feeling both devastated and resolute. She had found the answers she sought, but knew the path ahead would be even more difficult. The confrontation with Wendy and the revelations about the illegal scheme had changed everything. Isabella was no longer just a betrayed wife. She was now a woman seeking justice. And for the first time, she felt she was in control of her own destiny. The morning after Isabella's confrontation with Wendy was marked by an oppressive silence in her mind. Sitting at the kitchen table, her coffee mug had gone cold in her hands, but she didn't bother to refill it. Her thoughts churned relentlessly, revisiting everything she had uncovered and the cold, calculated words Wendy had spoken. Isabella desperately wanted to find some thread of humanity in all of this, some explanation that could justify what Landon had done. But the more she thought about it, the more she faced the harsh reality. He had betrayed not just her love, but the principles she had believed he held. Determined to deepen her investigation, Isabella returned to Landon's home office. The folders that had once seemed chaotic now began to make sense as she connected the dots between documents. She uncovered bank transfers to unknown accounts, many in the names of third parties whom she suspected were being used as proxies. Some of the inflated invoices matched specific contracts from Evans Engineering, signed directly by Landon, and in some cases, by Wendy. The scheme was more sophisticated than she had imagined, leaving no doubt that it had been meticulously planned. As she sifted through the papers, Isabella found something that made her pause. A receipt for a deposit made weeks before Landon's stroke. The amount was exorbitant, and had been sent to an offshore account. As much as Isabella wanted to avoid involving her family directly, she knew this discovery had to be shared with her father. Arthur's company could be at risk, and though it wouldn't be easy, Isabella felt it was her duty to protect him. That evening, she brought the documents to her father. They sat in his living room where the dark wood-paneled walls and warm glow of the fireplace created a cozy setting, but the weight of their conversation made the atmosphere tense. Arthur listened in silence as Isabella laid out everything she had discovered. His eyes, usually so full of determination, seemed to age as she spoke. He didn't interrupt, but when she finished, he let out a deep sigh, as though the air in his lungs carried the burden of a lifetime of work. "I've always had my suspicions about Landon, especially in recent years," Arthur confessed, his voice heavy. "He became too ambitious too quickly, but I never imagined he would stoop this low." Isabella felt the pain in her father's words. The trust he had placed in Landon, both personally and professionally, had been completely betrayed. But Arthur's greatest concern was for the company and the employees who depended on it. If Landon's scheme came to light in a chaotic way, it could destroy everything. "We have to tread carefully, Isabella," Arthur continued. "This isn't just about him. It's about protecting what your mother and I built." Those words hit Isabella hard. She knew her father was right, but she also felt an internal conflict she couldn't ignore. As much as Landon's crimes were unforgivable, there was something about his current state that made her hesitate. He was no longer the confident, domineering man she had once loved. Now he was a shadow of himself, dependent on others even for the simplest tasks. He no longer had the power to manipulate anyone, and Isabella couldn't help but wonder if exposing him so completely was necessary, or if his current suffering was punishment enough. Yet another part of her couldn't forgive him. Isabella knew that if she didn't act, she would be betraying not only her father's trust, but also her own principles. Landon had made conscious decisions that put her family and many others at risk. He had chosen to deceive her, and she couldn't simply ignore that. The battle between justice and compassion raged within her, making it impossible to find peace in any decision. As she grappled with these emotions, Isabella began to realize something about herself. The chaos Landon had brought into her life had forced her to confront truths she had avoided for years. For much of her marriage, she had lived a life shaped by external expectations, playing the role of the perfect wife and dutiful daughter. Now, with her illusions shattered, she found herself faced with an unexpected opportunity to reevaluate who she truly was and what she wanted for her future. These thoughts led her back to the hospital, where Landon continued his slow, painful recovery. When she entered his room, she found him sitting, gazing out the window with a distant expression. He looked thinner, frailer, but there was something in his posture that suggested he knew his situation wasn't just physical. Isabella sat beside him, placing the papers she had brought on the table. "I found everything," she said bluntly. "The contracts, the transfers. I know exactly what you and Wendy did." Landon closed his eyes, as though her words were a crushing weight. He didn't try to deny it, nor did he respond. "I need to understand, Landon," she continued, her voice softer now. "Why did you do it? Not just to me, but to my father, to the company." He tried to speak, but the words came out as incoherent sounds, and Isabella realized she would never get the answers she wanted directly from him. The Landon before her was no longer the man who had orchestrated the scheme. He was a shadow, someone who seemed to be paying an unbearable price for his choices. As she left the hospital, Isabella felt the weight of her impending decision. She knew that by turning over the evidence to the authorities, she would seal Landon's fate, but she also knew that doing so would protect her family and ensure the survival of the company. It was a choice that required courage, but also a complete detachment from the past. In the days that followed, Isabella reflected deeply on her own life. Landon's betrayal had exposed not just his weaknesses, but also her strength. She realized that for the first time, she had complete control over her future. Whatever happened next would be the result of her own choices, not someone else's. That night, as she gazed out at Seattle's city lights from her window, Isabella made her decision. She couldn't save Landon from the fate he had created for himself, but she could save her family, her dignity, and most importantly, herself. And that was exactly what she would do. The dawn of that day seemed to carry a new energy for Isabella, even though the timid rays of sunlight barely pierced the heavy clouds hanging over Seattle. She woke early, sensing something had shifted within her. During the night, conflicting thoughts had flooded her mind. Guilt over being on the verge of reporting Landon, relief at finally closing the chapter of secrets, and the inevitable sadness that came with ending everything her life with him had once been. But above all, there was a growing determination. It was time to take control. After reviewing the evidence one last time, Isabella placed everything into an organized folder. The bank transfers, the fraudulent contracts, the incriminating correspondence between Landon and Wendy, everything was there. The physical weight of the folder was almost insignificant compared to the emotional burden she had carried for weeks, but the act of gathering those documents reminded her that, for the first time, she was acting rather than reacting. She was no longer the passive victim of Landon's mistakes. She was the architect of her next chapter. Before leaving the house, Isabella made a call to her father. There was something comforting about hearing Arthur's voice, even through the phone. He already knew her decision and supported her, but had also made it clear that dealing with the consequences would not be easy. "You're doing what needs to be done," Arthur said, his voice carrying the kind of firmness Isabella had always admired. "But remember, no matter what happens, I'll be here. We'll face this together." Those words served as the final push she needed. Isabella gathered her things, took a deep breath, and drove to the police station. Each mile passed more quickly than the last, as if her heart was determined not to turn back. When she finally handed over the documents to the detective in charge, she felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. On one hand, she knew she had done the right thing. On the other, it was difficult to accept that the man she had shared 6 years of her life with was now completely exposed. Landon was no longer just an unfaithful husband. He was a criminal who had endangered everything she and her family valued. The impact of her decision began to manifest in unexpected ways. When Isabella returned home that evening, she felt for the first time the full weight of what it meant to leave Landon behind. His face invaded her thoughts, not the Landon she had seen recently, bedridden and frail, but the man she had known at the beginning, full of promises and smiles. She thought about the nights he held her after a hard day, the trips they had taken together, the laughter they had shared. Reconciling those memories with the man who had orchestrated a scheme that could have destroyed her family was almost unbearable. Yet, at the same time, Isabella began to understand that those memories did not define her. They were part of a past she could not change, but also did not need to carry forever. Accepting this was painful but liberating. She realized her love for Landon had been real, but what he had done did not negate the kindness she had given. If there was one thing she could take away from this experience, it was the strength that came from knowing she had been capable of loving deeply, even when the other person had failed. In the days that followed, Isabella gathered her family for an honest conversation about the impact of Landon's scheme. Arthur, ever pragmatic and direct, had already taken steps to mitigate the damage to the company. He and the legal team had reviewed every contract and partnership to ensure no further irregularities could harm the business. Still, the threat of a public scandal loomed large. The meeting was held at Arthur's house on a cold, rainy Sunday. Present were Isabella, her father, her stepmother, a reserved but supportive woman, and a few senior members of the company's executive team. Isabella began by explaining everything she had discovered, from Landon's involvement with Wendy to the financial details of the scheme. While most of them already knew the situation, hearing it directly from Isabella added a human element to the crisis. "I understand this is devastating for all of us," Isabella said, her voice firm but laden with emotion. "But we must remember that this company is bigger than one person's mistakes. It was built on years of hard work, on sacrifices my father and mother made to get us here. I refuse to let Landon's actions destroy our family's legacy." Arthur nodded in approval, but also emphasized the challenges ahead. "We have to be transparent," he said. "If the authorities come to investigate, we need to cooperate fully. We can't afford to hide anything, or it will come back to haunt us." Though the conversation was fraught with concern, there was a sense of unity among everyone present. Isabella realized that, despite Landon's attempts to tear everything apart, her family was resilient. They would face this storm together and emerge stronger on the other side. After the meeting, Arthur called Isabella aside for a private conversation. Sitting in his office, surrounded by old family photos and the company's awards, he looked at his daughter with a mix of pride and concern. "I know this has been harder on you than on any of us," he said, placing a hand over hers. "But by doing what's right, you've shown a strength you didn't even know you had. Your mother would be so proud." Arthur's words brought tears to Isabella's eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt she was moving in the right direction. It wasn't just about overcoming what Landon had done. It was about rebuilding herself brick by brick until she became someone she could look at in the mirror with pride. In the days that followed, Isabella began rediscovering parts of herself that had been stifled during her years with Landon. She returned to writing, a passion she had abandoned when life with him became an exhausting routine. She spent more time with friends she hadn't seen in years, reconnecting with people who brought her comfort and joy. She even began to think about how she might use her experience to help others. Perhaps one day sharing her story could inspire other women to find their own strength amid chaos. Isabella knew the road ahead would be long, recovering the company, dealing with the legal consequences of Landon's actions, and healing the emotional wounds he had left would not happen overnight. But for the first time, she felt she had the tools to face whatever came next. The Isabella emerging from this experience was not the same woman who had entered it. She was stronger, more resilient, and most importantly, more aware of her own worth. As she gazed out of her home's window that night, watching Seattle's lights flicker in the distance, Isabella felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She knew the future was still uncertain, but somehow that no longer frightened her. For the first time, she was ready to face whatever came her way, without fear and without regret. The morning Wendy was confronted publicly marked a turning point in the saga Isabella had been enduring. The confrontation took place during an emergency meeting called by Evans Engineering's lawyers to address the impact of Landon and Wendy's illegal scheme. The top-floor conference room, illuminated by panoramic windows, offered a view of a stormy sky, mirroring the tension in the air. Isabella, Arthur, and a team of lawyers sat with grave expressions. Wendy had been summoned under the pretense of discussing her role in problematic projects, but the true purpose of the meeting was to present evidence and leave her no escape. When Wendy entered the room, she radiated her usual confidence. She greeted everyone with a faint smile, maintaining her composed demeanor. But that composure began to waver as the meeting unfolded. One of the lawyers opened by presenting the documents Isabella had gathered: bank transfers, fraudulent contracts, and incriminating correspondence. As the evidence was laid out, Wendy's expression shifted. First, there was skepticism, then palpable tension. Finally, she realized her web of lies was unraveling. "These accusations are completely unfounded," Wendy declared, attempting to maintain her composure. "I'll need access to those documents to review them." Arthur, who had remained silent until then, intervened with commanding authority. "You'll have your chance to review them, Wendy, but it will be in court. What's clear to everyone here is that you violated our trust and compromised the integrity of this company." Arthur's presence brought weight to the situation, one Wendy couldn't ignore. She glanced at Isabella, perhaps hoping to find some reaction she could exploit, but met only a cold, unwavering stare. Isabella felt no satisfaction in seeing Wendy exposed, but she had no compassion to spare either. The damage Wendy and Landon had caused was irreparable, and Isabella was determined not to let her walk away unpunished. After the meeting, Wendy was formally dismissed from her role at the company and instructed to cooperate with authorities. The looming weight of impending legal action hung over everyone involved, but especially over Isabella, who knew her battle was far from over. As the legal pressure on Wendy mounted, Isabella decided it was time to have one final conversation with Landon. Despite everything he had done, there was a deep-seated need to close this chapter of her life directly. Landon had been a significant part of her life, however painful it was to admit, and Isabella knew she couldn't move forward completely without addressing the lingering, conflicting emotions he evoked. At the hospital, Landon looked visibly weaker. His health complications were worsening, and the doctors warned that he likely didn't have much time left. When Isabella entered his room, she found him sitting on the bed, gazing out the window. He turned slowly at the sound of her footsteps, his tired eyes meeting hers. It was difficult to look at him without feeling a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, and a small trace of compassion she couldn't quite suppress. "I need to talk to you, Landon," Isabella began, sitting in the chair beside his bed. Her voice was calm, but there was a weight to her words that he seemed to understand immediately. Landon attempted to respond, but his speech was still severely impaired. He gestured weakly, urging her to continue. "I've turned over the evidence to the authorities," she said, looking directly at him. "There was no other choice. You put my family at risk, Landon. You endangered everything we built, and I couldn't just ignore that." Landon's eyes filled with tears. He tried to lift a hand toward hers, but his strength had left him. Isabella hesitated before taking his hand. There was something deeply human in that moment, a final connection between two people who, despite everything, had shared years together. "I wanted to understand why you did it," she continued, her voice softer now. "Not just to me, but to my father, to the company. But maybe I'll never truly understand. Maybe even you don't know why. What I do know is that I can't keep carrying this pain. I have to let it go, Landon. I have to let you go." Tears slid silently down Landon's face. He tried to speak again, but the words came out as indecipherable murmurs. Isabella leaned closer, trying to make sense of what he was attempting to say. With great effort, he managed to whisper something that sounded like an apology. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. As much as Isabella wanted to believe his words, she knew there was no rebuilding from this point. Whatever Landon felt or didn't feel no longer mattered. What mattered was that she was finally finding a way to free herself from the past. Before leaving, Isabella turned back to him one last time. "I hope you find peace, Landon. Somehow. Somewhere." With that, she left the room, leaving behind not just Landon but the weight he had represented in her life. In the hospital corridor, Isabella took a deep breath, as if the simple act of walking away from that room was a step toward freedom. In the days that followed, Landon's health continued to decline. The doctors informed Isabella that he was suffering from multiple organ failure, the result of complications from his stroke and heart attack. They warned that the end was near. While this news carried an inevitable emotional weight, it also brought a sense of closure Isabella had been longing for. It wasn't relief exactly, but an acknowledgement that their story was reaching its inevitable conclusion. Isabella chose not to be present for Landon's final moments. She felt she had already said everything that needed to be said. Her presence now wouldn't change anything. As Seattle went about its daily routine under its characteristically grey and heavy sky, Isabella began to see the first signs of a life beyond the storm. The confrontation with Wendy, the emotional farewell to Landon, and the progress of the investigation had all been essential steps in her journey. Now she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The dawn over Seattle brought a pale, tentative light, illuminating the tall buildings and rain-slick streets, as if the city itself anticipated a defining moment. For Isabella, that day would mark the end of a cycle that had consumed months of her life. She woke early, as she had since deciding to take charge of her own story. With a cup of black coffee in hand, she gazed out the window, watching the city stir to life. On the table in her living room sat the folder containing the final documents and testimonies, a complete dossier exposing every detail of Landon and Wendy's scheme. It was the last piece she would deliver to the authorities. Reaching this point had been far from easy. There had been nights when Isabella questioned her choices, wondering if she should simply leave the past behind and move forward. But she knew she couldn't, not while the damage caused by Landon still loomed over her family and her father's company. Justice had to prevail, and this was the only path that would allow her to move on with dignity. When she arrived at the district attorney's office, Isabella was received with seriousness and gratitude. The prosecutor, a meticulous and seasoned man, thanked her for her cooperation and assured her that every piece of evidence would be thoroughly examined. As he leafed through the documents, Isabella felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The cycle of secrets and lies Landon had spun was finally nearing its end. That afternoon, Isabella visited the hospital for the last time. Landon had been moved to palliative care. His days were now numbered. When she entered the room, he appeared even weaker than during her previous visit. His skin was pallid, his eyes sunken and dim, but when he noticed her presence, he attempted a faint smile. She approached slowly and sat in the chair beside his bed. There were no words left to say. Everything had been said. Everything had been felt. Isabella simply held his hand for a moment, a simple gesture, yet one laden with meaning. Landon tried to speak, but the murmurs that emerged were incomprehensible. Instead, he gestured weakly toward the bedside table. Isabella reached for the object he indicated, a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. On the paper was a crude drawing, the lines shaky and uneven. It was a self-portrait of Landon, clearly drawn with great difficulty, but full of intention. Beneath the drawing were the words, scrawled in irregular handwriting, "I didn't deserve you." The words hit Isabella like a silent wave of emotion. It wasn't forgiveness she felt, but something closer to acceptance. It was the acknowledgement that Landon, despite everything, had grasped the depth of his failings. This final gesture didn't erase the past, but closed his chapter in her story with a faint echo of humanity. She folded the paper and placed it in her pocket, then stood and looked at the man she had once loved for the last time. "Goodbye, Landon," she said, her voice steady but tinged with quiet melancholy. She left the hospital without looking back. That night, Landon passed away, leaving Isabella with a strange sense of closure. It wasn't relief, nor pure sadness. It was a blend of mourning and liberation, a confirmation that even in his final moments, he had recognized the harm he had caused. A few days later, Wendy's trial began. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and Isabella's testimony as a key witness solidified the case. Sitting in the courtroom, Isabella watched Wendy as the prosecutors detailed every aspect of the scheme. Wendy maintained her composure through much of the trial, but there were moments when Isabella detected something different in her eyes, not remorse, but a kind of resignation, as if she had known this outcome was inevitable. When the verdict was delivered, 8 years in prison, Isabella felt a pang of relief, but it was a partial relief, tempered by somber reflections on Wendy's motivations. How could someone become so deeply entangled in something so destructive? Was it pure ambition, or was there something more behind her choices? Isabella realized she might never have all the answers, but at least she knew justice had been served. After the trial, Isabella returned home and spent a long time in silence. The house felt emptier than ever, but for the first time, the solitude didn't scare her. She retrieved the paper with Landon's drawing and placed it in a box along with other keepsakes from the past, sealing it carefully. It was a symbolic act, a gesture of preserving what had been but no longer allowing it to define her. In the days that followed, Isabella began rebuilding her life in earnest. Arthur's company, despite the initial impact, managed to recover thanks to the swift actions he and his team had taken. Isabella, on the other hand, decided to dedicate part of her time to initiatives that helped others overcome betrayal and loss. She started a blog, sharing her journey with honesty and hope. To her surprise, messages of support and gratitude poured in from people who found inspiration in her story. One night, as she looked out at the city lights through her window, Isabella felt something she hadn't in a long time: serenity. The journey had been long and painful, filled with highs and lows, but she had survived. More than that, she had grown, and while the scars remained, they now served as reminders of her strength and resilience. The cycle of secrets and lies had finally come to an end, and with it, Isabella was ready to begin again. The months following Landon's death and Wendy's trial were a mix of transformation and introspection for Isabella. The sense of freedom that had begun to take root now blossomed fully, though not without moments of doubt and lingering sadness. It was like walking an unfamiliar trail. There was always the fear of stumbling, but the allure of a new path was irresistible. Isabella spent those first months reconnecting with the parts of herself that had been neglected during a marriage built on illusions. Her days remained busy. Arthur's company demanded constant attention to maintain the trust of clients and partners, but she began carving out small moments for herself. She returned to writing, an outlet that had always helped her process her thoughts and emotions. Her home, once a space of emptiness and sorrow, began to feel warm and inviting. A few changes, new artwork, carefully tended plants, transformed it into a sanctuary that reflected her evolving identity. One afternoon, while organizing old papers, Isabella came across a journal she had started shortly before meeting Landon. Its pages were filled with the dreams and plans of a young woman who was optimistic and in love with life. As she read her own words, a wave of emotions washed over her. The woman who had written those pages was still there, buried beneath layers of pain and disappointment. Reclaiming her essence would become her next focus. At work, Isabella's relationship with Arthur grew even stronger. Her father, always a figure of leadership, now revealed a more vulnerable side. They had long, heartfelt conversations, something Isabella had never thought possible. Arthur admitted he felt guilty for not recognizing Landon's true intentions sooner. For Isabella, these talks were both comforting and a chance to reaffirm her bond with him. "Dad, you did the best you could with the information you had," Isabella reassured him during one of their conversations. "And because of that, we were able to save the company. We can't change the past, but we can honor Mom's legacy and keep building something to be proud of." Those words brought visible relief to Arthur, who faced challenges with renewed optimism. The company regained its stability, and while Isabella was hesitant about fully immersing herself in the business, she became a kind of ambassador. She attended events, championed social initiatives, and represented the family's values in ways that inspired confidence. Rebuilding her friendships became another priority. During her marriage, Isabella had lost touch with many close friends. She began reaching out, sending messages, arranging casual meetups, and reviving bonds that had faded over time. One such friend was Claire, her best friend from college, who welcomed her back with open arms and no judgment. "I missed you so much, Bella," Claire said during a lively cafe reunion in downtown Seattle, "but I'm so happy to see you finding your spark again." These moments were pivotal for Isabella. Honest conversations with Claire and others reminded her that while the past was painful, it didn't have to define her. Each rekindled connection was a step toward embracing a rich, vibrant life that had always been waiting for her. Still, the nights could be lonely. There were moments when Isabella found herself thinking about Landon, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. He was a reminder of how the wrong choices could consume a life filled with potential. The self-portrait he had left behind remained tucked away in her box of memories, not as a symbol of pain, but as a reminder that even those who hurt us deeply are, in the end, human. With time, Isabella began exploring new activities. She joined a writing workshop and found an unexpected support network. Her stories of resilience and growth drew attention, and she was soon invited to speak at small local events. Sharing her journey not only helped others, but became a form of healing for herself. One event in particular left a deep impression. After her talk, a young woman approached her, visibly moved. "Your story gave me the courage to face my own situation," she said. "I've been afraid to leave a toxic relationship, but now I feel like I can start over." Those words stayed with Isabella for days. Knowing that her painful experiences could inspire others was an unexpected balm for her soul. The scars of the past remained, but Isabella felt she was finally building something new. This became even clearer when Arthur surprised her with an unexpected proposal. "Isabella, you've always been a strong, visionary woman," Arthur said, pride evident in his voice. "I want you to take on a larger role in the company, not out of obligation, but because I believe you have so much to offer." The offer left Isabella torn. While she felt a sense of duty to the family and the company, she also knew she needed to balance that with her own dreams. After days of reflection, she found a solution. She would take on a more active role, but maintain the flexibility to pursue her personal passions. In the months that followed, Isabella found a rhythm that felt right. Mornings were dedicated to the company, but afternoons were hers, spent writing, attending events, or simply exploring the city. Seattle, with its stories etched into its streets and its often grey skies, became a place where Isabella found beauty, even in melancholy. As the first anniversary of Landon's death approached, Isabella decided to visit the spot where they had been married, a small garden in Queen Anne with a view of Elliott Bay. Standing there in silence, she reflected on everything that had transpired. There was sadness in her heart, but also acceptance. She knew life would never be perfect, and challenges would always come, but she now felt equipped to face them with courage and determination. As she gazed out at the bay, a line she had written in her journal months earlier echoed in her mind. "Starting over isn't about erasing the past, but learning to live with it in a way that makes us stronger." With a soft smile, Isabella stood and began walking home, knowing that the next chapter of her life was just beginning. She was no longer the woman who had entered that marriage years ago, full of dreams but also naivety. Now she was someone wiser, more resilient, and most importantly, more true to herself. And that was all she needed to move forward. When faced with betrayal and the pain of an unexpected new beginning, which path would you choose? Seeking justice, forgiving, or finding the strength to rebuild your life beyond it all? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If you missed the last story we shared here on the channel, here's what happened. After years of living with the certainty that his wife had perished in a tragic accident, Jack Thompson focused all his efforts on rebuilding his devastated family. However, his world is turned upside down when, during a visit to the beach, he encounters his wife alive in the company of another man. Determined to get answers, Jack dives into a web of lies, betrayal, and crimes that once again threaten the safety of his family. How far will he go to protect his children and uncover the truth? Find out now by clicking on the video appearing on your screen. See you there.